So let's start with understanding the basics of CSS. What does the C stand for in CSS? So that's the cascade, cascading style sheets. And so this is the cascade that works like a waterfall, that one thing leads to the next. The cascade takes an unordered list of declared values for a given property and a given element, sorts them by their declaration precedence, and outputs a single cascaded value. Now that's the technical definition, but let's get into what we really mean. And basically it decides which style wins, that one thing is here, another thing is on top of it, another style is created, which one is going to be the one that displays, or how do they work together? So the cascade is how it goes down the tree to determine which style is displayed. So the attributes that the CSS algorithm uses basically goes in a very specific order. So it starts with the origin and the importance. There's the selector specificity, like how specific was the selector set, and I'll explain more about that. Order matters, so which one came first, which one comes last, and any inherited properties that may come from the browser or from other style sheets and other technologies that are coming. And so all of these things come together to determine which is displayed. And so we'll walk through each of these now. Origin. So the origin and the importance. So the browser has some default values. So if you ever think of links being blue, the reason is the first browsers, all the links were always blue. And so that is the default value. It comes with a serif font that has feet. And so Times New Roman is pretty much the one that is the typical default browser font that you see. And so that's what you see at the top. Well, users can put in their own defaults. Most people don't do this, but often people who have a handicap, they can actually put in certain defaults that they want things. And so often you'll see people automatically increasing the font size, for example, or changing the colors because that makes it easier for them to see. Or sometimes audio browsers have their own defaults. But then what we'll be controlling most of the time is the document styles. And so how are the styles added to or displayed through from the HTML and the CSS together? And so we'll be working on the document styles, but know that there are things higher in the tree that we don't have control over. Inline styles are a big part of how specific we get. We also have the ability to do different selectors and pseudo classes and type selectors. We'll go over each one of these, but ultimately we can be very specific in what we want displayed or how we want it displayed, or we can be pretty general and then more specific tags would override it. So let's talk about that. First, let's talk about where and how we provide our style sheets. So when we talk about proximity, we're talking about how close the styles are to the tag that we're trying to work on. So here you'll notice we have HTML tags. So here we have an H1 tag, okay? And we can have three different ways of doing this: inline, embedded, and external styles. And so the way to think about this is whichever's closer wins, right? Closer overrides what's farther away. So if we have the tag over here and we have inline HTML, so something that's right next to it, that's going to win over something that is embedded in the head or linked later. So let me show you an example of each one. Here is an inline style. It uses the attribute style tag, and we give it the CSS that we want and put those in there. It's not the most efficient way, but you'll see it's very close. So obviously it wins and overrides any other styles that were coming. So no matter what, this H1 will be blue with a margin of 30 pixels on the left. But we don't want to use that. What we want to do is to be able to write efficient code. And if you're doing this, you have to change it every single time, and it's not the best way to work. So rarely in this class will you ever be using inline styles. Now, embedded styles are a little bit better than inline in that we can set them for the whole document. So you put embedded styles in the head tag. So you'll notice that what I'm showing here in this example is HTML. This is an HTML page, and this is inside the top of the head here. So we have a style tag in the HTML, and we put and write our styles there. So we're just putting HTML inside the head tag. this is better than the other, but ultimately we would have to change it on every single page if we wanted to change the color of all the H1s across the site. And so that's not the best way to go. I do use this sometimes when I'm just trying to quickly fix something or work through a problem, or maybe I'm working on an assignment to help a student or something. I might do embedded styles just to be quick. But where I want you to be doing is externally linked styles. And that's where we have a style sheet. We have a document that is separate from the HTML. That way we can change one document and it changes it across the site for all the HTML pages. So here's an example. In the head tag of the HTML, we have a style sheet linked. And so we basically say what's the reference, or where's the URL to it, and then what's the type, and it links out there. From that point on, then it will inherit and bring in those styles. So I said the word inheritance. Let's talk about inheritance. This is how things that happen come down to each element. And what's nice about inheritance is it simplifies things. So if we knew that we wanted every single piece of text on the page to be a single font and all of the text was going to look the same, then we can declare that in the body, which is the highest point. Then we can inherit that at all the other classes. So unless we change the font, we don't have to say it every single time. So you can imagine how big a style sheet might get if every single style you had to say the font, the color, and any other properties you wanted to add. So you should think of inheritance as it starts at the top, think big, what are the things that I want across the site and that I won't have to change more often, and then it comes down. So we have the body tags. We can have IDs and classes, and we can say anything with this ID, with inside that ID, we want it to be a particular properties, have particular properties for it. So inheritance really helps us to move. It also can be confusing because you'll have parents and children, and you'll inherit something from the parent, but not realize where that style is coming from. And so we've got to learn how to debug and understand where that's coming from. We also have selectors, and this is how do we choose what element we want to apply. This is important in CSS, but it'll also be really important in how we do our JavaScript later in this class. But in CSS selectors, this is specifically how we set a part of the page. And so we have type, ID, and classes. And I'll show you each one of those. There's examples there on the screen at the bottom. The top here is how you HTML have the HTML tag has an ID, this tag has a class, and this is a type HTML tag. And here at the bottom is how the CSS is rendered. So pounds, or hashtag as people know of it now, but this is the symbol for an ID. A dot is the symbol for a class, and none at all is a type. So here we have type selectors. Think of these as your main kind of the generic HTML properties and tags that you see all the time. H1s, Ps, list items, the things that are happening all the time. Body, those are the ones. Okay, they have, you don't have to put a dot in front of them because you're not giving them a class name. IDs are things that are used once and only once. So make sure that you only use your IDs once. In CSS, you can get away with it, but we don't want to get in that habit because in JavaScript, it will really matter. So IDs are used once. Think of those as structural things on the page, your header, your main content, your footer, those types of things will be your IDs. And then we have classes, and this is what most of your CSS is coded into, is a particular class that we give it a name. So we can name it, and we use the dot syntax there for in our CSS. And so you can see in the HTML, we have a div class, and then the way we connect that is in the CSS, we use a dot. But then there's also this thing called pseudo classes. And this is where we can apply other properties that happen on particular events or kind of common things that happen in HTML. So here's the most common example that we use for pseudo class, which is how we handle a link. So an A tag is a type tag, and then we can add pseudo classes on top of it, which is link, visited, hover, and active. So when that link is hovered over, you will get this color. When it has already been clicked on previously, but you visited and it's stored in that computer, then it will look another color. You may or may not want that to change. But then if it's, one selected and those kinds of things, then we can control all of this. And so we put those in there. And so you will use pseudo classes as well. But there's more than just the ones that I just mentioned. There's a whole lot of them. And so you'll just look these up and kind of see which ones you need when you need them. But especially on forms, there's a lot of different pseudo classes for you to use. We can also use attributes. And this is essentially what we're doing in HTML when we add a class or an ID is we're adding an attribute to the tag. So we added the attribute of ID or we add the attribute of class. That's what we're really doing behind the scenes here. And so then we can add compound selectors as well. So you'll see here in my HTML, I have an H1, which is a type. I have an ID and I have a class. So what would happen here is it would see whatever is from the ID 1, it'll inherit all of those things, but it will also take into account whatever is in the class. And so if I wanted to target this very specific H1 and not all the H1s, here's one way that I could do that. I say anything inside of the div 1 and has a class of 2, color it red. Okay. Now, this is not the most efficient way. You wouldn't actually just do this on one link. There's reasons you would want to do this. But I want you to see this in case you see this in examples, that you can get very specific and or be very broad in kind of how you define those. So if you had all of your H1s, you just want them to all be red, that would be one thing. You just would put it on the type selector. But if you wanted a very specific one for a very specific reason, then you might go to a very specific compound selector. When we have two selectors and they have the same specificity, they're very specific in the same way, the declaration that comes last in the source code wins. So what is defined last in the HTML or the CSS? So as you go down the CSS document, if they're exactly the same, the last one wins. Okay. Now I want to talk about the box model. This is something that I think a lot of students who are new to CSS, they kind of think they've got it, or maybe they think they have an idea of how it works, but they may not exactly understand what is doing what. And so I want to make sure you do understand it so you can work very fast and efficiently when you're debugging your CSS and you're writing your CSS, that you'll know the difference between margins and padding. So this box model is how CSS works to handle spacing and things around an element. So first, we have a margin, the outer portion. The margin controls how close our item can get to any other item. Okay. Inside of that is the border. The border can be 0. The border can be 100 pixels, 1500 pixels, whatever. It can be huge, but most of the time it's either 1 pixel or not used at all. We also have padding. Padding comes inside the border. Padding controls all the elements inside that box and how they are spaced out. So we have padding, border, margin. Okay, margin controls the outer elements and how close something can get. Padding controls the inside and how things inside of this box will interact with each other. Okay. Also to remember is just go ahead and memorize top, right, bottom, left. Top, right, bottom, left. Think of it clockwise. Top, right, bottom, left. And as we write in our code, our CSS styles, when we want to deal with margin on two sides or one side, it always starts at the top, goes to the right, to the bottom, to the left. And so I'll show you that. But let's look at an example and see if we can talk about how these are used interchangeably. So what we have here is a quote box. And so this is a class called quote box. Now, if we want to control how close this text gets either to the edges or to each other, I want you to think about it. Which property would we change? We would change padding, the things inside of quote box. If we want to change how close two quote boxes can be to each other, then what would we change? We would change the margin. Okay, so margin controls the outside, padding controls the inside. But we could also have a ID or even a class, and we'll just call it box holder, right? Box holder is our class that holds all the quote boxes. So box holder, if I wanted to change the spacing of all of these from changing information in the box holder class, what would I change? Well, that's inside of it. So I'm going to change the padding. So I could say box holder, this div across all of them, change its padding, and it would space out those boxes. Okay, this is something you kind of got to get into and play with and kind of just understand how it works. But remember, the padding is inside, margin is outside, and then top, right, bottom, left, right? So work clockwise around. Those are some of the basics I wanted you to have, and now you're going to go in and practice it. So I have given you an assignment, and what your goal is to take the basic HTML I've given you, write CSS in the proper ways, and to make it look like this. So you're going to have an image here, and I'm giving you generic HTML, and you turn it in to look like this. Please note that this is an image that I put for your reference, but it's just an image, and you're going to float it to the right. I'll go ahead and give you that little hint. You're going to float that to the right, but that is an image over here. And you're going to make sure that your headlines, your H2 are blue. You're going to have links that are blue. You're going to note you have different styles for lists here. Note that there is some type of spacing here. Around this, there's no spacing at the top, but there is some spacing at the bottom. Okay, so those are the things I'll be looking for. So I want you to do this and turn in a link in Sakai. And what you're going to do is you're going to upload your folder that includes your images, your HTML, and your CSS in an organized way. You're going to upload that to your server, and you're just going to turn in a link to me for class.